Doctor almost gets condemned until the receptionist stands up and defends him with proof. The notification arrived on a Friday afternoon when the clinic was already almost empty. Julian picked up the envelope with a slightly trembling hand and read those words no doctor ever wants to see. Ethics complaint for alleged negligence in patient care. There was a name on it, Mrs. Martha, a 72-year-old patient he had been seeing for nearly 5 years. He stood still in the hallway for a long time, holding that paper like someone holding something they don't quite understand. Maya, who was finishing up closing the system at the front desk, noticed his expression before he even said a word. "What happened, Doctor?" Julian handed her the paper without speaking. She read it again. And then she looked at him with a look that mixed confusion with something deeper, a tightness in her chest she couldn't even explain to herself at that moment. The accusation was serious. According to the document, Julian had prescribed Mrs. Martha an anti-inflammatory medication that the patient had on record as an allergy. The elderly woman had suffered a severe reaction, and on her son's initiative, the case had been brought before the State Medical Board for a formal hearing. If it were confirmed, Julian could be suspended. He could lose the right to practice medicine. Maya knew, better than anyone, that it made no sense at all. You know, sometimes you work with someone every single day, and it's only in a moment of crisis that you realize how much that person means to you. That moment, standing there between the two of them, said a lot without using a single word. Julian was 42 years old, with a shaved head and a face that carried that mix of weariness and care that good doctors sometimes develop over the years. He wasn't the type to cut corners. He was the type who wrote everything down, who asked how the family was doing, who called the next day to make sure the patient had understood the instructions. His private medical clinic in a small Midwestern town had a reputation precisely because of that. He was the doctor everyone wanted their mother to see. Maya had been with him for 8 years. She arrived at 24, fresh out of a business administration degree, and she stayed because the clinic ran with a sense of order she respected. Dark hair always neatly tied back, a white blouse almost every day because she said it gave patients more confidence, a direct way of speaking that some people mistook for coldness, but those who knew her understood it was just her way of being honest. "This is wrong," she said, handing the paper back to him, not as an attempt at comfort, as a statement from someone who was certain. "I need to understand what happened. Do you remember her appointment?" She thought for a second. "I remember. She came in because of joint pain. You ordered tests and prescribed an anti-inflammatory. I typed up the prescription." "Exactly. And what I prescribed wasn't what's in this complaint." The two of them looked at each other in silence. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The hearing was scheduled for 18 days away. Enough time to build a defense, but not that easy when what was at stake was the official version of a digital medical record that said something completely different from what Julian remembered doing. He hired a lawyer that same week, an older man named Arthur, who had worked with healthcare matters for many years and who, upon reviewing the electronic medical record, stayed quiet for far too long. "The document is technically correct," Arthur said one afternoon when the three of them met. "Doctor, Julian's digital signature is there, the date is there, the edit history is there too. If someone tampered with it, they did a very good job." "Someone tampered with it," Julian said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "That I believe. The problem is proving it." Maya said nothing at that moment, but something kept spinning in her head all night long, a memory from years ago, a habit she had adopted when she first started working, when the private medical clinic system was still unstable, and she lived in fear of losing data. A notebook, a dark blue hardcover notebook, where she wrote down the day's appointments by hand. Patient's name, time, reason for the visit, and when the doctor dictated the prescription, she jotted it down as well before entering it into the system. She had stopped doing that about 2 years ago, when a new system arrived, and she began to trust technology more. But before that, There were 8 notebooks stacked on a shelf at home with entries from every working day. She slept poorly that night. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Maya was kneeling in front of the bedroom shelf, pulling out notebook after notebook and flipping through them carefully. 3rd notebook, 4th, 5th. Her handwriting was small, neat, each line filled with the same dedication she put into everything she did, and then she found it. The right date. The name, Martha Elizabeth Higgins. Time, 2:30 p.m. Reason, joint pain in the right knee, history of hypertension, reported allergy to components of the Oxycam family. And the medication Julian had dictated that day, low-dose sodium naproxen, with instructions to take it with a meal. Maya stared at that line for about 3 straight minutes. What appeared in the system's medical record was diclofenac, a compound from the exact family the patient had listed as an allergy. This wasn't a typo, This was a deliberate swap. She grabbed the notebook, hugged it against her chest for a second, and went to call Julian. His voice when he answered already told her he hadn't slept. She said everything at once, without stopping. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end. Maya. His voice sounded different. You kept this, all these years. You know I'm careful. Yes, I know. Now they had proof. But proof of what exactly? That her notebook showed something different from the system? The lawyer Arthur would rightly say that anyone could claim the notes were made after the fact. They needed something more, something that would corroborate it from an independent source. Maya started thinking as if she were solving a logistics problem, which was what she did best. If Julian had prescribed naproxen, the neighborhood pharmacy would have received a naproxen prescription. The neighborhood pharmacies kept the paper prescriptions for a period of time. If the neighborhood pharmacy where Mrs. Martha used to buy her medications still had the original from that date. She spent the entire Saturday afternoon going from one neighborhood pharmacy to another. The 3rd one she walked into, one with a yellow facade and a hand-painted name on the wall, had a middle-aged employee named Patty, who knew everyone in the neighborhood by name. Martha? Of course I know her. She's been buying here since before you were born, my dear. Maya explained the situation carefully, without exaggeration. She asked if she could check whether the prescription from that day was still on file. Patty looked at her with a look that assessed her intentions. Then she said she'd see what she could do. 15 minutes later, Maya was holding a copy of the original prescription, handwritten by Dr. Julian Sterling. Sodium naproxen, with the date, with the signature, with the doctor's medical license number. She had to hold back the urge to cry right there at the neighborhood pharmacy. There was another piece of the story that still wasn't clear, and that piece was what troubled Maya the most. Who had tampered with the system? To access the electronic medical record and alter an entry with Julian's digital signature, a person would need a high level of permission in the system. The only users with that type of access were Julian and, for a short period, Dr. Victor Thorne. Victor had been Julian's colleague. For almost 2 years he rented an office inside the private medical clinic. They shared the reception, the system, the support staff. The partnership had ended on not-so-friendly terms. Victor wanted to buy a share of the clinic. Julian didn't want to sell, and when Victor opened his own clinic a few blocks away, his departure was marked by harsh words and an even heavier silence in the days that followed. What Maya had forgotten, but which came back to her as she drove home with the prescription in her purse, was a small detail. When Victor left, Julian had asked her to revoke the colleague's access to the system. But there was confusion that week, a high volume of patients, and she put it off until the next day and then the next. And when she finally went to do it, the system indicated that the user was already inactive. She had assumed the system itself had deactivated it automatically after some time, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. I had to stop here when I learned of this detail, because this happens in real life. You leave something for later and then, in a way you never expected, that thing comes back. There's no way to prepare for it. In the days that followed, Maya didn't rest well. She went to the office of Arthur, the attorney, with the notebook and the copy of the prescription, explained everything, and saw in the man's eyes something that hadn't been there the week before. Real hope. "This changes the situation quite a bit," he said, "but I need more. If there was unauthorized access to the system, I need the platform's technical manager to issue a report with the access history for that period. Julian listened to everything sitting at the table, his hands spread open on the wood, his face with that expression of someone holding in a great deal all at once. When Arthur left the room to call technical support, Julian turned to Maya. "Why are you doing this?" She looked at him as if puzzled by the question. "Because you're innocent. You could simply testify in the case as an employee. You're going way beyond that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with that matter-of-factness that was just her way, 8 years. Do you know how many families have come through this clinic in that time? How many times did I see you stay after hours because a patient couldn't leave on their own? It's not about going beyond. It's about not being able to stand by when something is wrong." Julian didn't answer, but when she turned to leave, he said very softly, "Thank you." The access report arrived 3 days before the hearing, and there it was, an entry on Victor Thorne's profile in the system, made at 11:14 p.m. on a Wednesday, 2.5 months before the formal complaint, on a date after his official departure from the clinic. A modification to Martha Elizabeth Higgins's medical record. When Arthur called Julian with that information, the doctor was silent for so long that the attorney thought the call had dropped. "Doctor, Julian, I'm here. We have enough. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. That really helps us who are just getting started. Now, continuing. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning, in a room with light wood paneling and chairs upholstered in brown leather, the kind of setting designed to make people feel the weight of being there. At the head of the long table, presiding over the proceedings, was board member Diane Montgomery, a woman with a firm posture and a gaze that missed nothing. On the other side, representing the complaint, was Mrs. Martha's son, Timothy Higgins, a middle-aged man with slumped shoulders and an expression that wavered between determination and something that seemed like discomfort. Beside him, a lawyer Maya didn't recognize. Julian was sitting at the defense table in his white coat, his hands clasped with a calm she knew took effort. Maya sat behind him, in the row for supporters, with the blue notebook on her lap and a copy of the prescription inside a folder. Arthur opened the defense by presenting the context. 18 years of practice with no prior incidents, over 4,000 patients seen at the private medical clinic, consistent references from colleagues and the community. Then he asked that the technical analysis of the medical record be done before any conclusions. The complainant's lawyer presented the electronic medical record with Julian's digital signature and the supposedly wrong medication. Board member Diane wrote something on the pad in front of her without taking her eyes off the document. That was when things started to take a turn for the worse. The board member sitting to Diane's right began asking questions with a different tone. He wanted to know why Julian hadn't reviewed the allergy history before prescribing. He wanted to know if the clinic's procedures were regularly audited. Julian answered carefully, but you could feel the narrative heading toward a conclusion that wasn't the right one. Then the board member said the sentence that changed everything. In light of the documents presented, and in the absence of evidence contrary to the recorded medical record, it seems necessary to consider. Maya stood up, not impulsively. She stood up with the notebook in her left hand and the folder in her right hand, wearing a white blouse, hair pulled back, and spoke with a firm voice that carried across the entire room. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have evidence to the contrary." Board member Diane raised her head and looked at her with that expression of someone weighing whether or not to listen. "Who are you?" "My name is Maya Brooks. I've been in charge of reception and administration at Dr. Julian's private medical clinic for 8 years, and I have documents showing that the medical record presented was improperly altered after the date of the appointment." A murmur spread through the room. The complainant's lawyer spoke up immediately, saying witnesses and documents should have been presented earlier, that the process had procedures that needed to be followed, that... Board member Diane raised a hand, and silence returned. "Let the young lady speak." Maya placed the open notebook on the table, on the page with the right date, and explained her habit of handwriting every appointment log since she started the job. She presented the entry for Mrs. Martha's appointment with the medication Julian had prescribed that day. Then she took out the copy of the prescription provided by the neighborhood pharmacy. Same date, same compound, same signature. Finally, she handed over the system access report with the time, the date, and the identified user. She wasn't trembling. Her hand was raised holding that document, and her eyes met the board members with a clarity that left no doubt about what she believed. Julian was sitting there looking at her with an expression I don't quite know how to describe. It was astonishment. It was gratitude. It was also the look of someone realizing he wasn't as alone as he thought he was. I don't know about you, but that moment hit me in a way I didn't expect. Some people show up in your life without warning, and you only realize how much their presence means when the moment calls for it. Board member Diane examined the documents for a long time, going through them calmly, one by one, the way people who understand the gravity of a situation tend to do. Then she turned to Timothy. "Mr. Timothy, do you have any explanation for the discrepancy between the medical record presented and the documents that were just shown?" Timothy was pale. He looked at the lawyer beside him. The lawyer stayed silent. "I received information from the medical records of a person who said they had seen the situation and could help prove what happened." "Who was this person?" A long silence. Timothy lowered his head. "A doctor. He said he had access to the records and that the file showed clear negligence. He said all I had to do was sign the investigation request." The board member took notes. The board member to her right, who minutes earlier had begun moving toward an unfavorable conclusion for Julian, sat quietly with his eyes on his notepad. The hearing was suspended so the new documents could be formally reviewed and so the system's technical supervisor could be summoned to confirm the access logs. That would take a few more days. But when Julian left that room that morning, he was a different man from the one who had walked in. Not because everything was resolved yet, but because there was now a clear line between what had actually happened and what someone had tried to make it look like had happened. In the hallway, after everyone had left, Julian walked over to Maya and stood in front of her for a second, not knowing what to do with his hands. Then he placed both hands on her shoulders, gently, like a gesture from someone who can't find the words. "Maya." "It's settled," she said, with that practical bluntness of hers, but her eyes glistened a little. 3 weeks later, the formal conclusion arrived. The technical report confirmed the unauthorized access to the system. Victor Thorne's name was documented, with time and date. The board closed the case against Julian with no penalty, along with a note indicating that the doctor had been the target of intentional record manipulation and that the case would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Victor didn't want to talk to anyone. His private medical clinic sat in silence for days after the news spread through the small Midwestern town. As all news spreads in small towns, word of mouth, reaching everywhere before the person involved has time to prepare. Timothy went to Julian's clinic one afternoon without calling ahead. He walked into the reception area with his wide-brimmed felt hat in his hands, that hat he kept turning between his fingers without stopping, and asked to speak with the doctor. Maya went to the office to let him know. Julian was quiet for a moment before answering. "Send him in." The conversation between the two lasted almost half an hour. When Timothy came out, he had a different expression, less heavy, like someone who had left something behind without knowing for sure if it was the right thing or not. Julian stayed in his office a while longer before appearing at the reception desk. "How did it go?" Maya asked. "He said he regretted it from the start. That Victor showed up with the whole story ready, the documents ready, and said all he had to do was sign an investigation request. He promised it would come to nothing, that it was just to create pressure. Timothy was angry. He needed money, and he let himself get carried away." "And you?" Julian took a deep breath. "I said I understood. Not that I agreed. That I understood." Maya nodded slowly. But the part of the story she didn't expect came 2 days later, when Mrs. Martha showed up at the clinic without an appointment. She was 72 years old, and she moved with a carefulness that wasn't weakness. It was the wisdom of someone who had learned to respect her own body over the years. her white hair neatly combed, the crochet bag she always carried on her arm, the upright posture of someone raised to believe that posture said something about who a person was. She walked into Julian's office and sat in the chair across from the desk. "I heard everything," she said before Julian could speak. "I always knew you hadn't done anything wrong. I tried to convince Timothy not to go through with it from the very beginning. He wouldn't listen to me." "Mrs. Martha." "Let me finish, Doctor." She looked at him with a gentle firmness. "I raised that boy on my own after his father left. I worked as a housekeeper for 20 years to pay the bills. Somewhere along the way, he got this anger at the world that I honestly can't fully understand. I'm not excusing what he did. I'm just saying I know where it comes from." Julian stayed quiet. "You were the doctor who saw me when I was afraid of last year's test result. You sat right here and explained everything to me calmly without rushing, as if I were your only patient of the day. I couldn't let that go without coming to apologize in person." She took a sealed glass jar out of her crochet bag with a handwritten note on top. "Homemade caramel sauce." "Made it yesterday." Julian received the jar with both hands and stared at it for a second before looking up at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha." "Take care of yourself, Doctor." She got up, adjusted her bag on her arm, and left with that careful, dignified step that was her way of moving through the world. A woman who had spent her whole life carrying weight without complaining, and who at that moment chose to let a weight go. There are things we go through that leave a mark. But there are others that when they end leave a clarity, a certainty that it was worth not giving in, not bending, not letting a lie win just because it seemed easier than fighting. That afternoon, when the last patient had left and the private medical clinic was just the two of them, Julian went to the reception desk with the jar of homemade caramel sauce and set it on the table between them. "Open it," he said. Maya looked at him with that direct way she had that was all her own. "That's no place to eat, Doctor." "Open it." She opened it. 2 disposable cups, 2 spoons taken from the little cup by the water cooler. They stood there in the empty reception area, eating homemade caramel sauce at the end of an afternoon that had taken a long time to arrive, and neither of them needed to say another word. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. What would you have done in Maya's place, with 8 years of work and the risk of getting involved in a situation that big? Leave it in the comments. We read everything. Thanks a lot for keeping us company as always. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.